It's summer here in New York City, so that means that a lot of my Phalaenopsis orchids are starting to bloom. And not just any Phalaenopsis orchids, it's my Novelty Phals and my summer blooming Phals that are starting to bloom. So in today's video, I'm going to share the differences between the summer blooming Phals and the more common Phalaenopsis orchids that you get in a supermarket. They're not too different, but they do have some differences in care, very slight. But I'm going to show you the differences and why I like these a little bit more than some of the standard Phals. So as I said, I kind of like these more than the standard Phals because a lot of them have so much fragrance. So the Phalaenopsis bellina is one of my favorite species orchids, and this one smells just like lemons. It's so nice. It's so strong. It's quite easy to grow as well. We'll get into the care shortly, but the fragrance on these, you really can't beat them. My LD's Bear King, I'm staring at it right now. It's on my windowsill. That one smells like oranges, very strong oranges. It is wonderful. This one right here, LD's Sunrose LD, smells like cotton candy. I have it in my bedroom, and the fragrance wakes me up. It is so wonderful. This one right here is the Phalaenopsis Sogo Relics, and this one smells like grapes. You really can't beat that. And then this one is Apricot Glow. I've smelled a very faint fragrance on it. I don't remember, but right now it doesn't smell like anything. Not all of them are fragrant, but a lot of them are, and I think that's one of the best parts of them. Another difference with these orchids is that they tend to bloom in warmer temperatures. So the Phalaenopsis orchids that you get at a supermarket usually bloom in the winter. They start spiking in the fall when the temperatures cool down. These tend to spike and they give you sequential blooms as well when it starts warming up. So a lot of these start spiking in the spring and then start either blooming in the spring or in the summer, and sometimes they go all the way through fall. So when your supermarket standard winter Phalaenopsis, the no ID types, usually they when they fade, that's when these guys get started. But what's really cool about them is that a lot of the blooms on these are sequential, not all of them. This one can go for a while, but not as much as some of the others. But when a bloom falls, there's usually a bud right behind it ready to bloom as well. So like this one is fading, and then we have another bud coming in behind. The same is the case with the bellina. Usually it blooms like now, and then it has another bud right behind the flower. So they kind of keep going for a while. The blooms tend to be a little bit more waxy. They tend to last a long time. They can bloom easily 6-7 months without stopping. I'm finding it for these two, the Sogo Relics and the LD's Bear, LD's Sunrose as well. They can last quite a long time, which is a really nice treat. So between the fragrance and the longevity of the flowers, it's amazing. There's so many species. I just showed you the bellina. There's the Phalaenopsis amboinensis. That one is kind of weird because it smells like burnt rubber. I have two of them, a yellow form and a creamy white form. That one is super interesting. That one blooms more in the fall. Sequentially, it lasts a long time. Flowers are beautiful, but it smells like burnt rubber. There's the Phalaenopsis Subtropical as well. That one smells more waxy, but it has super unique blooms. It blooms all throughout the summer as well. Those are really cool. There's just so many. There's so many species. There's so many hybrids that they're called novelty Phals or summer blooming Phals that they continually bloom. In terms of the flowering season with these, as I said, they flower when it starts getting warm. So you start seeing spikes forming in the spring. They usually bloom in the summer through the fall. And then in the winter, they usually take a break. Sometimes they can keep blooming through winter if you have very, very warm conditions, but not all the time. But between March and I would say November, I usually have lots of blooms with all of these orchids. These orchids like the temperatures warm to hot, I'd say. You could get away with intermediate temperatures as well, as long as they're not too cold. I'd say between 75 and 85 degrees is a good sweet spot, especially with some of the species that they like it very warm. So you could check out the specific care for the species orchids, but the hybrids, warm to hot is ideal. I wouldn't let them get below 60 degrees. And usually they get some sort of day-night temperature differential of at least 10 degrees, and that is pretty normal for them in the wild as well. So that's how they grow and bloom optimally. I find with these, they're more thirsty than the other kinds of Phalaenopsis orchids. So like the Bellina is in fluffy sphagnum moss, and this is 100% moss in here. I do have some rocks in the bottom to help with drainage, but this orchid, I water it as it's approaching dryness. I don't wait for it to get bone dry. I don't let it dry out too long. I just find that they like a little bit more moisture than the other Phals, so I tend to let it almost get completely dry, then I water again. So for this orchid, because it's in such a big pot, that could be about 5 days. It really depends on your temperatures, what media it's in, so that really is environment dependent. But I've noticed, and I've had more success with watering them just as soon as they're almost dry. Again, you can, if you let them dry, don't let them dry out for extended periods of time. If the plant is mature, it's okay. If it's a seedling, you could set them back. But I don't leave these Phals to dry too long. And I just give them a little bit more water than the standard winter blooming Phals. In terms of the care, they're not super fussy. So with light, they usually get lower levels of light. I give them sort of intermediate indirect light. I grow them under LED lights or an east-facing window, and it works really well. They don't need Cattleya level light or Vanda level light, nothing like that. In fact, if you give them too much light, you might scorch the leaves, so you just have to watch out for that. With that said, some of them can adapt to it slowly, but they get intermediate level light is what I give them. You could get away with low level light. These are not high light requirement orchids. These orchids do like it humid. Especially the species where they grow in the wild, it's usually very close to the equator. They have usually very hot and humid conditions. So I emulate that by giving them a good media for it and making sure that I water it just as it's almost dry so that the environment around the roots is pretty consistently humid. So that's why I tend to use sphagnum moss. What works for me may not work for you. It depends on your environment. A lot of folks ask me about sphagnum moss. I have multiple videos on how I use it. I have a lot of success with it here in New York City. Here in the winter, it's very dry and cold in the winter. But in the summer, it's very hot and humid. So I have a lot of variability in the temperatures here. And I find that very fluffy sphagnum moss works well for me. But folks down in Florida, sphagnum moss with the humidity down there might be too much. It might always stay very soggy. It may not dry the same way that it dries here with the speed that it does here. So it really depends on your environment. Some people like coconut husk. Some people just use straight up bark and water it more often. It really depends on your environment and how often you water. But in general, I like to make sure that they have a mixture that can retain a good amount of moisture to make sure there's good humidity around the roots, because especially the species in these summer blooming Phals, they do tend to prefer higher humidity. So I have all of these pretty much in sphagnum moss. I sometimes use bark if the pot is larger than 6 inches. I find it very manageable and it doesn't pack down too much if I use a smaller pot, because the roots tend to grow very well and they absorb the moisture and the pots are not staying soggy for excessive periods of time. But that's different when you're using a much larger pot. The moss can pack down. Flushing is more of an issue. It's harder. So if I have one of these in a 6-inch pot or larger, I then add some chunky bark just to keep it more airy, but it still has a very high ratio of sphagnum moss, where it probably has like 60-70% moss and then 30-40% chunky bark. This one is a 5-inch pot, and I have rocks on the bottom to help with the drainage, and it's doing very well for me. But like I said, it's all very environment dependent. I repot these orchids about every 2 years. They tend to have very good root growth. Let me show you this one right now. A lot of these novelty phals, they have so many roots. This one I repotted last year, and I might have to repot it this year. It's growing through the bottom of the pot. This one is in 100% moss with a bark topping. I like to repot usually every 2 years, unless it's something like that that's outgrowing the pot. Because if you use sphagnum moss, it can break down. I use New Zealand sphagnum moss, very high quality, usually lasts 2 years at least. But if you use bark or coconut husk, it may break down a little bit. So I say about every 2 years is good to repot them. Again, it depends on the quality of your media. If it hasn't broken down, let's say if you're using orchiata bark that lasts a very long time and it hasn't broken down, you can get away with keeping it there for longer. But moss generally breaks down a lot faster. Low quality moss can break down within a year. Higher quality moss you can get away with every 2 years, or it becomes acidic. I'm a big fan of these orchids just because I find them so beautiful, especially this apricot glow right here. This is a cross between the Phalaenopsis fasciata and the Phalaenopsis equestris. It's just so beautiful. Every time I see it, I just love the way that those blooms look. This one over here, the fragrance is just so wonderful. This like cotton candy. I adore it. It's so wonderful. This was actually mislabeled when I bought it. This was supposed to be a Phalaenopsis speciosa, and it was mislabeled, but I really liked the bloom and I kept it. And this fragrance is really what got me hooked. It smells literally just like cotton candy. This one here smells like grapes. Like I said, my LD's Bear King, it smells like oranges. And then I have another one, LD's Bear Queen. I bought it because I bought it because it's the sibling to the LD's Bear King. This one is LD's Bear Queen. It has Phalaenopsis bellina in it. And that one also smells kind of like lemons, but like a different kind of citrusy fragrance. So it's really the fragrance on a lot of these that I really like about them. I love that they bloom more than once a year. They just keep blooming sequentially. Unlike the other more common Phalaenopsis, I love those too. They last a really long time, but those typically don't have fragrance. They do bloom in the winter. It's good to have them both, because then when these are done, you could have your standard Phalaenopsis blooming all winter, and then you have something kind of in bloom all the time. But if I were to pick between the standard phals and the novelty summer blooming phals, I definitely pick these kinds. They just smell so good. They're so pretty. Anyway, guys, let me know your favorite summer blooming and novelty phals down below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.